Birch is one of the most useful trees in the northern forest. Birch can be used to make containers, clothing, glue, band-aids, syrup, and tea. Birch trees and logs are often host to a wide variety of mushrooms as well. Birch comes in several different species, but they all have a smooth bark with a short horizontal line pattern. White birch and yellow birch in particular both have papery fragments of bark that can be peeled off easily. These fragments are highly flammable and water resistant, making them some of the best materials to start a fire. And the betulinic acid helps them ignite under almost any weather conditions. Birch bark strips can also be used as band-aids on minor cuts. The inner parts of the bark have anti-inflammatory properties and can be used to get rid of warts as well. I like to combine the bark with an adhesive like pine resin or balsam resin. Alternatively, you can wrap the cordage around birch bark to keep it in place. The bark and branchlets of birch can be used to make a medicinal tea. The tea from yellow birch and sweet birch are particularly good because they have a wintergreen taste to it. Sweet birch has the highest percentage of methyl salicylate, which is an aspirin-like chemical that can help reduce pain. The best way to extract all the properties of birch bark is to make an alcoholic tincture because the terpenes like betulin and betulinic acid are not very water soluble. There are a wide variety of handicrafts that you can make with birch bark. You can make containers by folding whole sections of the bark like origami into different shapes. You can also cut birch bark into a lot of long, thin strips. Once you have enough of these strips, you can weave them together like a normal basket. This method is great when you have imperfect pieces of bark that don't fold well. I weaved a decent birch bark basket in the spring, but my technique needs some work. This is how you can make a sheath from birch bark. Fold a strip of bark like a wallet, and it should have 2 pockets that are roughly the same length. Then weave a smaller piece of bark, alternating in and out of both of the pockets. The result is a sturdy sheath that can hold knives, ferro rods, and other tools. It is best not to harvest bark from a live tree because cutting large sections of the bark off can potentially kill the tree. To harvest from a fallen log, make 2 cuts around the circumference of the log and then cut down the center. Then gently peel the bark away with your fingers. Certain Native American tribes use large sheets of birch bark to construct canoes that were lightweight and nimble. In Sweden and Russia, birch bark was used to make clothing like hats and shoes. One artist from Finland made an entire suit and suitcase made of birch bark. Birch can be tapped similar to sugar maple trees. The birch tapping season occurs 3 to 4 weeks after maple sap has started flowing. It takes over 100 liters of birch sap to equal 1 liter of birch syrup. So that makes the birch syrup much more expensive and time consuming than maple syrup. But it still can be worth it if birch is abundant in your area. Birch bark can be made into a simple spoon by cutting the bark into a shovel shape. Then make a small cut near the bottom and pinch the 2 sides together. Split a stick halfway through and insert your birch bark. This is a great utensil to make while camping. Birch tar is another interesting material that you can make with birch bark. The bark contains a lot of oils that make it waterproof and flammable, and they can be distilled. The birch bark oil can be put on tools to prevent rust, and it can be used to waterproof leather. It can also be made into a glue that was traditionally used to attach arrowheads and seal birch bark canoes. The tar can be put on skin to heal rashes and cuts. The oil is great for slow burning candles, and it repels mosquitoes. First, I collect bark from a downed yellow birch limb. Then I dig a hole and I put a soup can in it to collect the oil. Next, I find a larger metal container and put a hole on each end. Then I stuff the container full of birch bark and make sure the hole on the bottom lines up with the soup can. Build a small controlled fire around it, and the extraction process will take about 2 hours. You'll see the gases escape from the top of the container, and they might occasionally catch fire. After a few hours of extracting, the soup can should have some black oil at the bottom of it. You'll get roughly 25 grams of oil per 100 grams of birch bark. Oil can be stored in a mason jar and used for waterproofing, first aid, glue, fire making. Balsam fir is a common evergreen tree in New England and eastern Canada. This is one of the top choices for Christmas trees because of its shape and strong scent. The scent from the fir needles are so strong they are sometimes encased in a decorative pillow and sold as an air freshener. Balsam fir has a thin gray bark that is smooth except for the blisters that form on it. These blisters are filled with a sticky, fragrant resin. The resin is great for treating small cuts because it is antiseptic and antibacterial. The stickiness of the resin often stops or slows down minor bleeding. The resin is highly flammable, so you can combine it with other tinder materials and it should ignite quickly. The resin can also be used as an adhesive to help patch holes on tarps and tents, although it's best not to pop too many blisters on one tree. Compared with other conifer needles like spruce, the fir are friendly. They have soft needles that aren't as pointy and form in a slight spiral, but appear relatively flat on the branch. Fir needles are high in vitamin C, and you can make a woodsy citrus tea with them. Make sure to keep the water below the boiling point because that can reduce the vitamin C content of the tea. The new growth of balsam fir needles can be eaten in the spring. Similar to spruce tip, fir needles can be eaten raw or dipped in chocolate. Chocolate-covered fir is my favorite way to eat them. Sugar maple is the most important tree for maple syrup production. You can tap the tree when the daytime temperatures are above freezing and the nighttime temperatures are below freezing. The sap can be drank as maple water, or it can be processed down into maple syrup. This usually happens in late winter, but it can vary by location. In the summer, maple leaves can be made into berry baskets. Fold the 2 lobes behind the center lobe and then poke the stem through all 3. You'll have a relatively fragile basket that can hold a handful of berries. Eastern white pine is another evergreen species in New England and the northern Great Lakes region. It is the state tree here in Maine and is very common. Eastern white pine has a relatively smooth bark for a pine tree. The young trees and limbs of white pine have a smooth grayish-brown bark, which turns dark and scaly as it gets older. Eastern white pine is also identified by its needles that form in bunches of 5. All pine needles are high in vitamins A, B, C, and D, as well as calcium and magnesium. Pine needle tea is one of the best ways to get vitamin C in the winter. I try to add needles to my green tea every day. It is best to add the needles once the water is below the boiling point, because that'll keep the vitamin C intact. Pine needles can be fermented into a Sprite-like soda by combining them in a mason jar with sugar for a few days. If you find a fallen white pine tree or limb, you can cut the smooth sections of the bark with a knife or a saw. The younger portions of the trees and limbs tend to have smooth elephant-like bark. Carefully peel the bark apart with your fingers slowly, and try to keep the whole piece intact. You can fold the bark to make various watertight containers and baskets. I like to fold the bark at the corners, and then use sticks as paper clips to keep the frame in place. The bark will be bendable when it's fresh and full of moisture, but will become firm as it dries. You can even boil water in these containers by adding hot rocks into them. This is a great survival skill to learn if you ever lose your cooking pot. Pine wood is generally considered too resinous for indoor wood stove use, but makes a great wood for campfires. The resin and fat wood burn particularly well. Pine resin can be added to a pine cone on a stick for a simple torch. The resin can also be used to make natural glues and band-aids. Pine trees have both male and female cones. The female cones are thick and woody and are what we refer to as pine cones. In the springtime, the male cones release a yellow pollen. This pollen contains one of the few sources of testosterone in the wild. Most people see it as an annoying powder that covers their driveway, but is actually one of the most nutrient-packed foods in the forest. It is one of the few plants that contains bioidentical testosterone. 10 grams of pine pollen contain roughly 0.8 milligrams of testosterone. It also contains other androgens like DHEA, androstenedione, and androsterone. In addition to male hormones, pine pollen also contains amino acids like L-dopa, which is a precursor to dopamine. The powder contains a wide variety of vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D3, selenium, zinc, potassium, and magnesium. Now, the male pollen cones will be greenish yellow and tightly packed at first. As they get ready to release, they turn bright yellow and loosen slightly. The best time to harvest catkins is right before they start releasing pollen. You can collect the entire pine tips and cones together by picking or cutting them. Make sure not to take too many pine tips from any particular branch or tree, because this can stunt the tree's growth. You can also use a paper bag or jar to collect the catkins that are actively releasing pollen. This method is less efficient, but it does no damage to the trees. Once you are home, leave the pollen and cones out to dry. After a few days, any immature pollen cones will release their pollen. Put the pollen and cones through a sifter to isolate the pollen. You can also put the pollen in the freezer to break the cell wall. Freezing it can be a great way to crack the cell walls of the pollen. However, there isn't strong scientific research on whether breaking the cell walls is useful. Pine pollen can be used in a powder form raw. You can add to water, smoothies, or even oatmeal. Making a tincture with pine pollen, however, is one of the best ways to get the medicinal benefits. Pine pollen is fairly hydrophobic, so it's best to use a higher alcohol percentage for the tincture. You can make a tincture with the pine cones or just the powder for greater potency. The pollen will naturally want to rise to the top of the jar, so make sure to shake it every day. Pine pollen contains over 200 nutrients, including glutathione and superoxide dismutase. Glutathione is made by the liver naturally and binds itself to toxic chemicals to flush them out of the body. Superoxide dismutase helps protect our DNA and cells from oxidation. I find that pine pollen gives me extra energy and motivation, so it functions nicely as a pre-workout. I make extracts from wild chaga, reishi, and lion's mane, and they're available on my shop.